Hi, my name is Reuben. In this series of videos, I'll walk you through the sample Pool Doctors application that I developed for the introduction of Gennaro Mobile. In this video, I look at the job header list screen, which is an example of what I call the list drill pattern. So I'll run the application and show you the screen we're interested in. So we've got through the splash screen, and then we've come to our first screen, which is a list. And from this list, we can drill down into more detail. What we're looking at here is just the screen here. And in the application with the screen, we've got the options to change the values change the data that's displayed. So this icon here gives you the option to say displaying job code or job created date. So that's just changing the data that's displayed in our list. We can also sort our list differently, so either in job number code or newest to oldest order. And also in the application we can filter what's displayed. So at the moment I'm displaying all jobs, but I can display perhaps my new jobs or my in progress jobs or my complete jobs, or I go back to displaying all. What I perhaps should have mentioned is this icon on the left hand side as part of our application is displaying the status of the job. So that's a new job. That's a job we've done some work on, so it's in progress. And where the clock face is filled in, that's a job that we've completed our work on. So this icon's just showing the status of our job. So we have our list. We have our list of jobs, and we can change what's displayed, the order, and what particular rows are displayed. So let's have a look at the source code for that. Oh, sorry, and what I did mention here is once you've found a job, you can click on it and go and do something with it. So you can, for each job, we can then drill down to get more detail, and hence the name drill in the pattern. Okay, so that list was basically invoked from the splash screen. So we first see it in the splash screen. So on action splash, we've got call job underscore header underscore list dot list, and that's using the imported job header list module or job header list dot 4GL. So we've got a 4GL and a form, and for the rest of the application, what we'll see is a 4GL and a 4FD in close correspondence. So I'll look at the form first, so the 4FD. It's a very simple form, basically comprising one table and 3 columns. So if I'd created the form from scratch, I'd select a table and then add 3 columns to it. And I've given my 3 columns the name of major, minor, and image. And they basically correspond to the major, the major field, so which field we want to give the most, which is most important, so we're displaying in the bigger font at the top, the minor column, which is displaying more information, and the image column. The image column is an example of a phantom, so you don't actually see an image column here. We've set an image field to be of type phantom, and if we look at the major field, one of the properties in there will be image column, and that's an image. So that's the technique that the 4GL uses to associate an image column with a field. So we've got a phantom field containing our image data, and we've associated the image column with that major column. So that's the form. See, it's just a very, as I said, just a very simple table with those fields on it. And you'll find that it's the same for most of the list programs. They're just a very simple form with a small number of columns. So if we now look at the 4GL, so the job header list.4GL, what we should note is our schema. So we're relying on the Pool Doctors database to provide the schema, and we're defining a type, job header type, which is based on the database table job header. So from our database schema, there's our job underscore header, and these are the columns that make up that table. And so by using that record like job header, we're able to define a record that has a column for each, a field member for each column in the database table. And we define an array, a dynamic array, so unlimited length of that type. So that's where we store the information we get from the database. this second array here, m underscore arr, that's the array corresponding to the user interface. So there you can see the major, minor image that corresponded to the field names we had in the form. So I've got those. So all these list programs will have these two types of arrays, one holding the information from the database, and then another one for the image that we can display on the screen. So if we go down and make our way through the code, so here is our entry point for the control, the list function. We define what column we want to display. So this line of code is basically saying if we haven't defined what column we're going to display, and we're going to the job underscore code. So that toggle basically corresponded to that button there. Sorry, I should have mentioned that for these variables, toggle, filter, order by, they're basically corresponding to the values we're selecting out of each one of those. So we enter the function, set up a null value the first time we come through, then we open our window. So we're opening up that form we've got created there. And then we add a toolbar onto it. So if we look at across the bottom, we've got a toolbar. So I'll talk about those resources in a later video. But when we open the window, we add the toolbar to it straight away. Then we populate the database array, then the user interface array, and then enter into the dialog before when we exit, we close the window on the way back out. So I'll look at the database populate function first. It's down the bottom. First thing it does is clear an array, and then it builds up a SQL statement. So select everything from the job underscore header table and add a filter, so a where clause based on what we're filtering on, and then an order by clause based on which order the user wants to display the data. Then we declare a database cursor based on that SQL statement, and then we execute that SQL statement and iterate through the cursor to populate the array. So we're populating our database array with one row of data from that table. So we're using asterisks to indicate that we just want all columns going into all fields. So having populated the database, we then populate the user interface array. What that basically does is loops through every row in the database table array and then populates each row, and based on for the user interface, and based on the value of toggle, dictates what values we want to put in the major, minor, and the image column. So when we're running it, based on this value of toggle, we're changing what's to display in that second column. So what this bit of code here is doing is saying, based on that value, this is how we want to populate each of those columns. So each of those columns is getting a nice long expression. So in this instance, based on the customer code, we're finding the customer name. So the customer code is actually off screen to the right. You can see one there with a short name. So yeah, there's the customer code. That's the bit in the brackets, and we're displaying doing a lookup, database lookup to another table to find the actual customer name to display. And in that second column, and that's the same for the major column in both instances. And then in that second column, we're either displaying the job number or the job creation date. And then the image is basically, it's a little function, which I'll have a look at in a minute, takes in the job status value, and then returns an image field or an image name. So here it is there, based on the status, I or X, so open, in progress, or complete, returns one of those three images. And at some stage I was using different images for iOS and Android, but I could not do that test anymore. I could basically just based on that value, but I've left it open in case I need to change the image at a later point. So up to here, database populate, user interface populate. We've populated, select the rows from the database table and populated the array, m underscore arr. And now having done that, we then call UI list, which is then doing a display array to display the value of the array to the screen. Now in the attributes, always using unbuffered, I've got except equals false because we don't want to necessarily do anything with selecting a row. We're going to handle that ourselves inside the onActions But we've got true, which means this back entry exists, so we can go back to the splash screen. And we've associated the double click or the important action with the select action. And see, for this action, we want to display the disclosure indicator. So the iOS guidelines say you should display this indicator to indicate that you can drill down based on that value. So that's what that disclosure indicator does. And the select basically says that anywhere you tap on the row, it triggers the select action. So if we look in our 4GL code, we can see we've got a on action select, which basically goes down and views in more detail that job. So that was the display array. What else is in there before the display array? First time we go in, we check the length. If it's 0, then we give the user a bit of a hint to say, hey, you should go back to this other screen and sync data to get some data. Every time we go down to the select, we repopulate the arrays when we return. So the user may have changed something when they drilled down and looked at the detail, so we want to repopulate it when we come back. The final 3 on actions we can see here correspond to the 3 actions across there. So toggle, filter, and order by. So when we do toggle, we use a menu statement to display a list of options. So display a list of options and then record what the user selects and change the 4GL variable appropriately. And then based on if they have changed it, then we know we've got to go and, in this instance, repopulate the user interface array. Or if we change the filter or the order, we know we've got to redo the database operation again and then call the user interface array. So at this point, 4GL program will say we're in a display array statement. On action select to go drill down in more detail, and those 3 other actions, toggle, filter, order, to change what we're displaying in the array there. Okay, and when we so that's the display array, and once we've exited out of the display array, then we make sure we set the in flag back to 0, and we do that for all dialogues as well. So that's a quick overview. That's how we've implemented the job header list. So with a drill down, so the key things to note are you're going to populate the database using a select statement, and that populates this job header array, which is based on the database type. Then we go iterate through that array in the user interface populate function and populate the user interface array, and then we execute a display array using that user interface array and note the actions that the user then does. And the key thing when we're doing drill downs, you'll find the pattern will be we'll have a double click equals, in this case I've selected name my action select and set the accessory type equal disclosure indicator to indicate that you do want a chevron and you are going to drill down. That sort of also relates to your database. You'll see that pattern a number of times. So we've got our job header, we're selecting a list of rows, and then we're drilling down into it. Okay, so that's the job header list, and that's an example of what I call the list drill pattern as well.